Thank you, Shirley. And I want to greet all people from across the world that have logged in to this talk. In my indigenous language, we say "Aiches" to each other, which means good day. But as everybody is aware in South Africa, our language are on the brink of extinction, and our leaders are valiantly fighting for recognition in our country, although the history that we have in this country um, is hidden. It's hidden out. It's been written out of our school curriculums, and we are on this journey, and we are glad that you are able to journey with us. It's 8 o'clock in the evening here in South Africa. So I'm greeting everybody where it's afternoon or morning elsewhere in the world. But let me start with our topic for today, which is the inalienable right and the disconnected umbilical cord. The inalienable rights are personal rights held by individuals that cannot be surrendered, sold, or transferred to another person. These rights are inherent to human beings and are essential for ensuring individual dignity and freedom. These rights cannot be bestowed by law, customs, or belief. The Odom's Dictionary defines inalienable as that which may not be alienated. The US Constitution recognized that certain universal rights cannot be taken away by legislation as they are beyond the control of a government, being naturally given to every individual at birth, and that these rights are retained throughout life. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to have a new government. Now, the umbilical cord refers to the navel through which life substances are transported and is visible at birth. It resembles the beginning of life for a human being born from a woman. The Bible teaches us that man was created from the soil of the earth, and then Almighty God breathed the breath of life into man, which is now known as the Spirit. The umbilical cord for indigenous people refers to their rights to the land, the sea, the mountains, and the air. It is a tangible and intangible connection and right they have to the lands of their fathers. Now, my methodology is based on my spiritual and living umbilical cord connected to the land the world calls South Africa. Now, my humble apologies if I'm going to disappoint some of those who are locked in this evening, afternoon somewhere in the world, and morning somewhere else in the world, with my limited English vocabulary, as it has always been my second language growing up. This language has been forced, this language, pardon me, this language has been forced upon us by a system of oppression that never asked for our consent. Our ancestors' front teeth were knocked out to stop them from speaking their native language with all its beautiful dialects, and their languages are on the brink of extinction. Now, for me, growing up under apartheid came with its own challenges and has left an undeniable mark on our current nation's mentality and perceptions around identity. The one thing that will remain constant in the Khoi and San narrative, or as some shall call ourselves, Hottentots and Bushmans, is that we occupied vast lands in southern Africa before our ancestors were forced to abandon their livelihoods by the seafarers and the encroaching bounty groups from the East Coast. But let us start at the beginning. As culture developed in Western Europe and the centers of civilization around the Mediterranean Sea, people began to trade their goods in an attempt to get from others what could not be found at home. Some lacked salt or spices for their food, some iron for their weapons, some ivory, amber, precious and semi-precious stones, gold, tin, bronze or silver, which they had learned to use and by which they set great store. Trade was the most important means of contact between the early communities from Finland to Hellas, which is ancient name for Greece, and from the Irish island to Egypt and Mesopotamia, the land of the two rivers. The voyage of Vasco da Gama to the east by the Cape of Good Hope and the amazing discoveries of Columbus in the west drew back the veil from a new world. The circumstance of the discoveries being the Spaniards and Portuguese, nations strongly adhering to the papacy, open to the court of Rome, which was new and vast fields of missionary exertions. And whilst the cross of Christ was in their hands, the great objective was to subdue the newly discovered heathen lands, not more to the despotic powers of the respective governments of Spain and Portugal than to obtain dominion over the souls of man and subject them to the triple crown worn by the popes of the Catholic Church until recently, going far back as 1963. Accordingly, the wily pontiff, as the vicar of Christ on earth, gave the eastern part of the globe to Portugal and the western to the Spaniards on condition of converting the heathen to the Catholic faith. America chiefly fell to the Spaniards as the Phillip Islands, while Africa and the coast of Malabar with the east fell chiefly to the share of Portugal. The voyages of discovery made by order of this present majesty in the Southern Ocean brought to light vast countries before unknown and innumerable groups of fertile islands which invite the visits of the humane to soften by civilization the savage customs of their inhabitants and to communicate to them the intestable blessings of true religions. Suggestions had been made of the desirableness of attempting to communicate to them the knowledge of our holy religion, and a feeble effort to accomplish it had failed through the unfaithfulness of those who had voluntarily offered themselves for the service and had been a year under tuition with a view to the important object. Now, between 1503 and 1506, the Portuguese captain Antonio de Saldanha landed at Table Bay, which we all know is Cape Town today, and renamed it after himself. Trade with the koi and sand resulted in the Portuguese being attacked and Captain Saldanha being injured in a skirmish. Subsequent trade exchanges with Portuguese ships in 1505, 1506 occur without incident. But it's in 1510, on the 1st of March, the Portuguese aristocrat, soldier and explorer, Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, who was 16 years old at the time, and his crew attacked the koi and sand on the banks of the Salt River. The koi defeated the Portuguese in what Portuguese historians describe as the most humiliating defeat in the history of Portugal. The shame associated with a mighty colonial power losing a battle against unarmed savages must have been unbearable. The subsequent historiographical challenge was one of interpretation, making sense of what was probably considered an impossibility, namely being decisively conquered by an unarmed enemy. Here the Portuguese were slain by the hands of unarmed savages with stones and assegais of untempered iron with so little resolution on their part that it would seem as if God had ordained that they should perish in that place as a punishment for some cruelties of injustice of which they may have been guilty in their victories which he granted them. This was written by the Portuguese historian de Goy. They were killed by sticks and stones hurled not by giants or armed men, but by bestial Negroes, the most brutal of all at that coast. Between 1510 and 1610, the Portuguese avoided Cape Town. The Portuguese global imperial aggression was extremely active during this period, but not in South Africa. The Portuguese were the major commercial power of the world during the 15th and 16th centuries and controlled the spice trade, which the Dutch and British desperately wanted control over. And it was in August 1595 when 4 Dutch ships sailed into Cape Town and friendly exchanges took place between Dutch sailors and the local Cape Town people. This story is recorded in the 1598 publication, Principal Navigations, written by Richard Hakluyt. The chronicler of the 1595 Cape Town encounter was Captain Cornelius de Houtman, who records the encounter as follows. We went into the country and spake with the inhabitants who brought divers fresh victuals aboard our ships for a knife, a small piece of iron, giving us an ox or a sheep, 3 oxen and 5 sheep for a small bill, an axe, a shovel, a great iron nail, a knife, and other little pieces of iron, not worth 4 livres. Now, the 4 livres was the French monetary unit superseded by the franc of France. It was in 1597 that in the Statute Book of England that a law was passed giving courts the option to sentence a person to transportation to some distant land if he was convicted of a felony that did not involve murder or rape. I just want our audience to keep that in the back of your head, that this law was passed for convicts that were sent to foreign lands. And as we will continue on this journey, we will see the consequences of these peoples that arrived on our shores and what happened to our country. Now, it was Sir Thomas Smith that hit upon this idea and expression in the Cape to use condoned men from Newgate prison for his settlement in Cape Town. It is unlikely that the cruelties or injustice of which they may have been guilty in their victories, pardon me. I jumped the page, just hold that thought. It was Smith originally got his idea from one of the captains. We know that a certain Captain John Jordan in 1608 commandeered one of Smith's ships that visited Cape Town for 2 months. That was on the 14th of July to the 16th of September. Jordan, in his report to Smith, wrote, it can become a refreshment station for the company. It had an abundance of fish, birds, and animals for food, seemingly unlimited access to fresh water, a resourceful local population with whom he could communicate, and access to timber to repair ships. Jordan's anxiety, though, regarding Cape Town's people is evidenced by his proposal that a fort should be built with 4 corners and a sentry at each corner to provide protection. In 1598, the Khoisan killed about 13 Dutch sailors As the pilot of the ship, John Davies, chronicles the moment as follows from their landing in Cape Town on 11 November. The Flemings offered them some rude wrong. They absent themselves 3 days, in which time they made great fires upon the mountains of the country, which is today Table Mountain. The 19th year of they came great troops of them to us, bring much cattle with them, and in the battering, suddenly taking their advantage, they set upon us and slew 13 of our people with hand, dart, with 4 pikes, which was a weapon consisting of a long wooden shaft with a flat-pointed steel head. Davies goes on to describe the Cape. The land is a good soil, with wholesome air full of good herbs, as mints, calamint, trivelin, scabions, and such like. In 1612, the Cape people were likened, and I want you to listen to this. In 1612, the Cape people were likened to apes and baboons. Ralph Standish, a surgeon and member on board the 1612 expedition ship the Hacienda, which docked in the Cape, described Cape people with faces like apes and baboons with flat noses, and their heads and faces both beastly and filthy. He further articulates the view that the Cape people are unworthy of the land, which, as we saw, has been described as a paradise and the biblical Garden of Eden. In his own words, he writes, the country being fertile ground and pleasant, and a country with varied temperature, but the people brute and savage. He says, without religion, without language, without laws or government, without manners or humanity, and last of all, apparel, for they go naked, with only a piece of sheep skin to cover their members. Now, this is what we're going to challenge going forward with this discussion. It is recorded that Torrey, a Khoisan leader, was taken to England on board a ship called the Hector in 1630. Now, this Sir Thomas Smith seemingly wanted to teach him English to become a proxy for trading and return him to the Cape to advance British commercial interests. Torrey lived there for 6 months before returning to his native lands. Torrey worked out the ultimate agenda for himself and made a reasonable request in return. He asked Mr. Smith, please build me a house like yours in England, and then we can do business with my countrymen. By 1616, 1 year into the penal colony project, the relationship between Torrey's people and the settlers turned sour. Provisions were halted, and those convicts who were left on the seashore were slain. Torrey had successfully mobilized a Khoi and San resistant movement. But let us quickly bring the evolution story around human beings evolving from apes and the cradle of mankind found in South Africa. If this is true, if this is really true, roughly more than 400 years ago, Europeans regarded other races as inferior beings compared to themselves, even to the point that if you had no system of governance in place, you could not communicate with these savages because of the language barriers. They took it upon themselves to classify and categorize my people into the subhuman category, or as their writers put it bluntly at the time, apes or baboons. Which now begs the question for us today. How did we evolve so quickly over the past 400 years that we are now regarded as human beings? Whilst the apes and the baboons in our forests and national parks, which are frequently visited, by Europeans and those people from across the world, that the national parks are still what they were up until today. Clearly, what was written about us in the past doesn't make sense. And the reason why our lands and our livelihoods were taken away from us, they even gave it a legal term to defend the genocide and subjugation. They called our lands terra nullius, or in other words, no man's land. But let's move forward to the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck in 1652, a man credited with our current cultural identity and land dispossession. 8 years into the arrival of van Riebeeck, an encounter with indigenous communities at the time brings up a very interesting argument fought in the notes of Jan van Riebeeck. Please allow me to first pay homage in remembrance to those that has gone before us. We remember many of our ancestors like Otsamatu, Kretoa, Gogosoa, Kore, Douman, Klaas Dora, Koopman, Reiters, Jonker Afrikaner, Hendrik Witbooi, Hans Trompeter, Klaas Stuurman, David Stuurman, Kobus Wildskut, Boesak, Apollina, Saartjie Baartman, Kurikai, Arnoldus Theodor, Taibos, the Links family, the Bitterbos family, Nicholas Loggerberg, Andri Stoffel, as well as Adam Kok, and many others whose bravery are whispered in the corridors of state archives, libraries, and institutions of higher learning. Their names vanish to history, whilst their descendants are still alive today without land, language, and their true identity. Returning to the peace events in Cape Town, it were held in April and May 1660, which are very important to our discussion this evening, which took place at the fort of Van Riebeeck, following the first, as we call ourselves on this side, Hottentots Dutch War in 1659. Now, these events brought a formal end to the hostilities between the warring parties. But on closer inspection, if the records are dissected, conclude and support our view currently in our country. And that view is our right to claim First Nation status in South Africa. It amplifies the severe umbilical cord connection our people have to this land. But let us have a closer look at what transpired during this engagement between Van Riebeeck and the indigenous leaders at the time. The April peace event ran across 2 days. That was on the 5th and 6th of April 1660, with about 40 indigenous leaders led by Chief Gogosoa. The 5th of May peace event was much shorter and was attended by about 100 leaders led by Chief Kore of the Koranaikwas. The content was well articulated by both parties. The Hottentots explained their rationale for going to war, as well as pursuing peace. The Dutch, via Van Riebeeck, articulated their perspective, but more importantly, articulated their basis for claiming victory and ownership of the contested land at the Cape. To put it bluntly, the Dutch articulated their theory of conquest as the legitimate basis for their land grab of the Cape. In response, as a token of acceptance by the other party, this is now in the words of Van Riebeeck, some presentations are made in return. With us, this consists of copper, giving out my people tobacco, and entreating them to a party of food and drink. The same weather he describes, even the weather of the day, sky overcast and windy. And at the fort today, peace was renewed with the chief and overlord of the Kaapmans, with Otsomato, which some people call Harry die Strandloper, and with all the principal men and elders. We learn from the paragraphs which include the summit that there were in attendance about 40 persons from the Hottentot side. So peace was concluded, and the chief Gogosoa and all the principal men, numbering about 40 persons, all were presented with these gifts. Mutual promises were made that the one would no longer molest the other. But the Kaapman strongly insisted that we had been appropriating more and more of their land, which had been theirs all those centuries, and on which they had been accustomed to let their cattle graze. That's on page 195 of Van Riebeck's journal. They asked if they would be allowed, and I need for our audience to listen to this, if they would be allowed to do such a thing, supposing that they go to Holland. It would be of little consequence if you people stayed here at the fort, our leaders continued, but you came right into the interior and select the best land for yourselves, without even asking whether we mind or whether it will cause us any inconvenience. Remember, this is recorded by Van Riebeck. They strongly urged that they should again be given free access to this land, which are today Table Mountain. At first, we argued against this, saying that there was not enough grass for their cattle as ours, to which they replied, have we then no reason to prevent you from getting cattle, since if you have a large number, you will take up all our grazing grounds with them. They took their argument, Van Riebeck writes, one step further to drive home their position regarding rights to the land. As for your claim that the land is not big enough for both of us, who should rather give way in justice, the rightful owner or the foreign intruder? Let me repeat that. As for your claim that the land is not big enough for both of us, who should rather give way in justice, the rightful owner of the land or the foreign intruder? Van Riebeck makes the following observation, which clearly was an emotional exchange between the parties. They remained adamant in their claim of old established natural ownership. They continued that they should at least be allowed to go and gather bitter almonds which grow wild in abundance there, and to dig for roots as winter food. We will later return to the mentioning of the importance of roots to the indigenous cultural people in South Africa. Van Riebeck records further states, this request likewise could not be granted them, for they would then have too many opportunities of doing harm to the colonists. And furthermore, we shall need the almonds ourselves this year to plant the proposed protective hedge or defensive barrier. These reasons were, of course, not mentioned to them. He continues, Van Riebeck writes that the indigenes refused to back down and take no for an answer, but he had the final say. But when they persisted in their request, eventually they had to be told they had now lost the land as the result of the war and had no alternative but to admit that it was no longer theirs. The more so because they have unlawfully taken from us. Listen to this. They had unlawfully taken from us without any reason. Their land had thus justly fallen to us in a defensive war, won by the sword, as it were, and we intended to keep it. So that was the year that we, as the Khoi and San, or others we call Hottentots and Bushmans, lost the land to the Dutch. But let us park the bus for now by highlighting a couple of key points from our opening remarks. The Indigenes at the Cape, we have to agree, were superb debaters and presented intellectually superior arguments to Van Riebeeck. And to conclude that at the Cape, the bullet decided matters and not the brain. But let us start at the beginning of how we ended up at this point before we continue to the interactions with the missionaries. A French aristocrat, Guy Tecrat, records the following interaction that he had in 1687 with some of these indigenous people. He says, these people were convinced that there is no other sort of life worth living. They only do what is strictly necessary to secure a gentle existence for themselves. According to them, even to such are in service to earn a little bread, tobacco, and brandy. The Dutch are slaves who cultivate the lands which really belong to them. And they are faint-hearted folk who take shelter from their enemies in forts and in houses. They, the indigenous people, on the contrary, fearlessly set up their encampments wherever they will and disdain to plow the land. They maintain that this manner of life denotes that they are the owners of the country and are the happiest of men, since they are alone live in peace and freedom, and in that they say their happiness persists. Now fast forward to my ancestor and their interactions in 1799, a man by the name of Nicholas Stuurman. He made a profound statement that resonates deeply across generations of indigenes across the world today. He said, restore the country of which our fathers have been despoiled by the Dutch, and we have nothing more to ask. We lived very contentedly before these Dutch plunderers molested us. And why should we not do so again if left to ourselves? Has not the Grootbaas, he's referring to God, given us plenty of grass, roots, and berries, and grasshoppers for our use, until the Dutch destroy them, an abundance of wild animals to hunt. And will they not return and multiply when these destroyers are gone? Here you find a man that was fluent in 4 languages in the year 1799. He was fluent in Dutch. He could speak English to the British. He was used as an interpreter for the Dutch and the British to the Xhosas, and he could speak his native language. He spoke his native language, the Khoikhoi. As I carry on, so let us recall 1660 when the indigenous refused to their age-old practices of living off their lands. They wanted Van Riebeeck to allow them access to the age-old customs of living off the lands, to the grass, to the roots, the berries, the almonds, etc. Indigenous people always had sustainability practices in place when interacting with nature. They never allowed the complete annulment of their rights to the South African lands. The Eastern Frontiers history could attest to a 100-year history of resistance against dispossession and systemic discrimination. Klaas Stuurman articulates it very well when he met the missionaries van der Kemp and Reed for the first time in 1802. That's now before the second part of the Third Frontier War broke out. It reads as follows: they tried to convince him to lay down his arms and submit to the government, but he responded in the most emphatic fashion. He says to them, "We are blind heathens. We know nothing, and in this state the Boers wish to keep us. I wish to live a peaceable life, but I am determined to revenge the barbarous conduct of the Boers to my people, till the government shall do us justice and permit us to hear the word of God." His brother David Stearman, equally militant, had this to say to a young Dutch farmer, Thomas Miller, when confronted by the latter upon them taking 4 oxen from him. Miller says the following: "Who gives you the right?" In which David replies, "Mynheer gave us the right. Mynheer gave us these guys." Now, Mynheer was the Landros of the district at the time. Miller continues, he says to David Stearman and his men, "You are dirty skunks. You have no right to do what you please on my land." In which Stearman replies, "Your land, this is our country. May we not even borrow our own property?" And as we keep looking through the lens of history, the agenda becomes much clearer. The Garden of Eden could never again belong to the indigenes. This was in stark contrast to a law that was passed in 1636 and highlighted in 1830, which reads as follows: "The Aborigines shall be undisturbed in their liberty and never enslaved. They shall be governed politically and civilly as ourselves, and enjoy the same measure of justice. Good rules shall be made for teaching them, and especially their children, the truths of religion and the usages of civilized life. And care shall be taken to withdraw them from heathenish customs and from idleness, the mother of want, to the cultivation of the soil and to such social habits as their condition and capacity may bear." This was highlighted in London by Thomas and John and George Underwood. This coincidentally was the same year that Chief David Stearman who was born in 1773, passed away and had only tasted freedom until the age of 5 in 1778. For the next 20 years, pardon me, for the next 20 years, he was an indentured laborer on the farm of a Dutch farmer. He participated in 3 of the wars of dispossession. A man 3 times arrested and incarcerated on Robben Island, the same Robben Island that our great President Nelson Mandela was incarcerated for 27 years. This man was incarcerated 3 times on Robben Island. He twice escaped. The only man thus far that has done that. And he was finally banished to Australia in 1823 until his death in 1830. The question then is, how many of our unnamed ancestors suffered the same fate as Chief David Stearman? The umbilical cord connection to their lands was severed, disconnected, distorted, and omitted from the recorded history. Their identities obliterated by genocide, rape, mixed marriages, and forced assimilation to survive some of the most harrowing ordeals any man or woman can endure. Another man that was banished, like David Stearman, to Australia was a man by the name of Hendrik Uithaller. Most of them came from army regiments that resisted colonialism in South Africa. Eydler himself was the last man to be executed in Australia in 1863. He was sent to Australia in 1840 as a prisoner on the transportation ship, the Pico, with a group of other Khoi soldiers who had mutinied and fired into the officers' mess, killing an ensign. He was part of a group of Khoi soldiers who staged a mutiny in Grahamstown, today called Makanda, in the country's east, during a period when rebellion against British colonial expansion had reached a critical point. Eydler and his comrades were sentenced to death, together with 190 other Irish male convicts, which was then commuted to transportation and landed up in the colony of Van Diemen's Land, the present-day Tasmania in Australia. Historian V.C. Malherbe also mentioned that during this time in Australia, he and a fellow South African, Stuurman Jantjies, were sent to present-day Brisbane and were drafted into the border police. Part of their job in the police force was fighting the Aboriginal people who were mounting an increasingly fierce resistance against colonization and land dispossession. Now, Jantjies was about 1.55 meters tall and 20 years of age. He was married, described as illiterate, and marked with several blue dots and scars. Eydler, on the other side, was 28, also married, also described as illiterate, and just over 1.4 meters, described as being so short that he could neither saddle nor mount a horse unaided. They were put to work chasing runaways, tracing stray horses, escorting prisoners, keeping Aborigines at bay, and serving notices and carrying letters. Eydler escaped the death sentence for the second time while in Australia. This was during a dispute with a farmer for whom he was working, and Eydler was convicted of raping the farmer's wife. Now, this story of Eydler bothers me, a short man of 1.4 meters. That this short little fellow was described as somebody that did these hideous acts. But as we find later, that this was normal in Australia at the time, that whatever was bad, it's happening bad in Australia by these people, especially the indigenous people, they were convicted without any fair trial. Now, the rock art in South Africa is an abundant and is found in the southwestern and southern Cape, as well as the Drakensberg Mountains in the Eastern Cape, Lesotho and Swaziland. The best places to view rock art are in the Drakensberg Mountains, Cape Cederberg area, and the Karoo. Now, South African rock art has been dated to be as old as 28,000 years to about 100 or 200 years ago. The painting most commonly depict animal scenes with our eland and praying mantis regarded as sacred to the indigenes from time immemorial. Now, I want to read to you a letter which sums up the indigenous people of the country at the time. And it was a letter written by a man by the name of Kipido. He became the first evangelist under the missionaries, the LMS, in South Africa. Now, this is a man that was taught to read and write. And now this letter that is written, he wrote a letter to God with any punctuations, any full stops, just a letter, but just listen to the emotions behind this letter. The letter goes, "Dear and esteemed Reverend God, you made a big mistake this time and you must know it, otherwise things will stay wrong in this world. First, you took our father, he's referring to the London missionary, Dr. van der Kemp. You took our father, and now you come to take away my Anna, his wife. He says, Reverend God, this is not fair. All her life she tried to be good. She made the best soap in the whole land that washed the whitest much whiter than sin can wash. I know she did not always believe in you, but how can you blame her? She was a bushman, but in a deep heart she was a true believer. She believed in the stones and the water and the sky and the stars and the eland and the holy mantis, and everything was to her God, God, God. She made no difference between people and animals and stones and stars. She could talk to them. Or she was a good woman. She could make sparks come out from her. It was Anna, and I think those were real stars. Coming from her for 20 years, I lived with a star, and now you take her away. You know what I would like to say to you tonight is for Gonap. Our indigenous people call the devil Gonap, to take you and put you in his black heaven. But I know you have your own hell for us, and I wish you could go there yourself. Just to feel what it is like, for I am in that hell tonight. And if only once you could walk on live ashes and burn your feet, you will understand this pain that is in me tonight, God. I am sorry for Anna, and I am sorry for all the wrong I did in my life. I wish you could take me to be with her, for I don't want to live if she is gone. It's not fair, is all I can say tonight. It is not fair. And my heart is sore from your dearest, sorrowful brother, Kipido Cockroach. Here is a man that pours out his heart in a letter. But if we look at the context of what he is saying, it depicts to us how life was during the time that he was alive. The systemic discrimination are amplified in the following letter from the memorial inhabitants of the district of Utne, sprung principally from the Gona and the other Hottentot tribes. They write the following letter to the government: that memorialists have long been members of Pettelsdorp, which is the town I'm coming from, and can appeal confidently to their missionaries and neighbors for testimony to their conduct in their various pursuits. That hereto want of land has checked the natural increase of their cattle and deprived memorialists of the just reward of industry. Nevertheless, under great disadvantages, some of them have acquired wagons, oxen, cows, goats, sheep, and other property, and all possess competent skill in husbandry and as mechanics. That they wish to obtain grants upon certain tracts situated near the sea between the Bushmen and Sandys River, together with the Gora and lands adjacent in Utnek, at about halfway from Bettelsdorp to Theopolis, and to settle there. That they have been informed of applications being recently made for the said lands, but they submit their own claims to be superior to those of any other person whatever, and especially to the claims of individuals already possessing extensive farms. That memorialists know the value of instruction for their children and suitable means of religious communion for themselves, and trust to obtain the benefit of the provision recommended by His Majesty's Commissioners of Inquiry on their behalf, to which they doubt not they may be able hereafter in a reasonable time to contribute, that it may be right to impose certain conditions upon memorialists in order to secure these grants to their children, that as by events beyond their control, the cattle and other possessions have become few, they trust to have quittance remitted to them for 10 years, as was done in settling the Sierveld in 1817. They also pray that such conditions may be imposed upon memorialists as shall best secure the lands aforesaid to them and to their children. Now I am one of those children, and they desire to add that this application does not concern themselves alone, but also many other members of Petersdorp now absent cutting timber or upon journeys or in other employments, as likewise all such inhabitants of this colony as are entitled to the benefit of the late law. And memorial as in duty bound shall ever pray. And they signed their names, Moses Constable, Samson Theodore, and many others. As I'm landing in today's political landscape in South Africa, our Aborigines, the First Nation people, the indigenous Khoi and San people, also called Hottentots and Bushmans, who were forcefully colonized and dehumanized, stripped of their lands and possessions, are still facing the same challenges for recognition and restitution. The fight for our land and to gain back our status as the First Nation of our land is an ongoing process with no clear end in sight. However, the onus is on our cultural leaders and activists like myself and my peers to continue to make known the history of who we are, what happened to us back then, and to restore our people that which was and is still rightfully ours. We have the right to claim our lands, our mountains, our rivers, our culture, our language, the fish in the sea, which we are now alienated from. If we continue to pursue this matter for the recognition and restitution, we believe that one day we will be once again reunited with our motherland through the umbilical cord that once nurtured us, fed us, gave us identity, and where we could roam freely as true free beings emancipated from birth through the grace of our God, Chui Kruap, who created us in His image. If we were apes and baboons, barbarians, or whatever name they called us, to justify their land theft, then our God and their God must be the same God. And since God is God, the creator of everything that exists, the one that gave Moses the 10 commandments and the wisdom to our ancestors to write and sign our title deeds on the mountain walls and the caves, it is time that the history books get rewritten and reflect our true identity to the rest of the world. It needs to include our history, ancestors, and those who fought for our rights and freedom, and to have access to our lands that was stolen from us. Only once we receive recognition in our land and possessions get restored will our umbilical cord be made whole again. Our forebears lived on these lands for free, whilst we, as their living descendants, needs to pay to foreign investments to stay and to live here. Sida ke kuiba radan. Sida ke kuiba taunga. What I'm saying is, we win together and we lose together. There's a slogan in our country from the indigenous community, Khoi and San, which stated, nothing about us will be done without us. We demand that our status as First Nation people in South Africa be accepted and policies around our existence be reviewed going forward. Atu atama, kanske. Our struggle continues. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Captain Sturman. Everyone, please show your appreciation for a wonderful talk by using the reactions button if you can access it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.